Hey everyone, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about issues number 11, 12, 13, and 14 of Invincible Ironman, written by Jerry Duggan. But before we dive into the story, I want to ask you a favor. If you enjoy this video, please leave a like and a comment to help the channel grow. So with that said, this issue opens up with a dialogue that goes over Hazel's and Tony's honeymoon. Because now that Tony was married, people would most likely see him as boring and not worthy of a second look. Which worked perfectly for the newlyweds' plans, because once they retired to their room for the night, Emma handed her husband, Tony, his stealth suit. So, as our hero begins to armor up, Emma takes it upon herself to inform Tony that he is taking unnecessary risks. But see, Tony begs to differ, because, from his perspective, the Mysterium is worth all the risk. So just before he sets off, he tells Emma if anything goes wrong and he is caught and killed, then she should just walk away and disappear and let everything burn. So with Tony's mind completely made up, he proceeds to perform his disappearing act, as Emma goes on to tell Tony that the glasses he created to allow her to see everything he sees are working perfectly. So as Tony takes off into the night, he explains the real reason why he chose Hawaii. Now the reason he picked Hawaii was not just because they had a limited budget, but because of its close proximity to the main island of Krakoa. So as he approached his target, just to be sure of his safety, Tony decided to dive beneath the waves to breach the living island. Now once in, Tony partially surfaced, and when he did, he almost immediately understood what the mutants felt to see their own creation ruined, for before him was a squad of Stark Sentinels. So with the island heavily guarded, Tony went over his options. Now he could have completely cloaked his armor, but it'll be at a high power cost and it wouldn't cloak any of the exhaust from his propulsion. So he decided to play it safe and take the old-fashioned way up, by walking. So as he climbed up the stairs, Emma informed Tony that she took a modest amount of metal that was meant to be turned into gifts by Forge. So as he made it to the top, Tony was caught off guard by a few Orchis soldiers, but more importantly by the ape among their ranks. So with great care and caution, Tony managed to sneak right by the ape and into Emma's room, and made a beeline straight towards her closet, and upon entering the space, Emma questioned if he was truly invisible to the ape. Now, under any ordinary circumstance, this would be the case. But unfortunately, Phylon tuned their satellites to find a new element, and because of that, an anomaly on the satellite reading brought the ape to that spot. But in all honesty, the ape didn't expect to find Tony at the end of the trail. So as the fight kicked off, the ape informs Tony that Phylon will be so disappointed that his little pet CEO has been lying to him and still wearing a suit of armor. So as the fight began to escalate, the ape took Tony into a bone-breaking bear hug and continued to tell Tony that Phylon promised them that Stark was completely defeated. Which couldn't be furthest from the truth, because Tony let out a massive blast, which threw the ape against the wall. So as the two prepared for the next round, Tony tried his best to deceive the ape by telling him that he is just some guy wearing Iron Man armor. But see, this ape with multiple PhDs wasn't about to fall for Tony's lies. So the battle kicked back off, the two traded thunderous blows back and forth. So in a last-ditch attempt, Tony took the opportunity to bring the roof down upon his enemy, but to his surprise, more stones came down than anticipated. So in an attempt to save the ape, he reached out his hand, but was quickly rejected. So with the ape taken out, Emma asked Tony if he was able to track down the Mysterium. Which Tony responds with, yes he was able to, as and on top of that he was also able to find some other items that Emma would most likely enjoy. So with the chest in hand, Tony proceeded to cloak himself and his cargo and walked out the front door with no one being the wiser. Now, on a side note, Tony had only been on the island for a few minutes, but when he left, he had the strangest sensation that he was not alone. Because on that panel out in the distance, we see a person overlooking everything that just transpired. Now us as the reader, knew this person to be none other than Charles Xavier. And if you want more information about that storyline, you can check out the Immortal X-Men comics, which is also covered on this channel. But anyway, he also goes on to say it wouldn't be until much later, after the trial, that he would even understand how much danger he was actually in. So following that close encounter, we jumped back to the Hellfire Club where we found out that Tony kept his workstation under his room. So with the machine he liberated from Staines International, he managed to shape a Mysterium cane. Now the reason why he created this was because he wanted to test something out. So the first place he went was to the Jarvis Lounge where he had Carol Danvers, Miss Marvel, attempt to break the cane. And to her surprise, the Mysterium cane did not break. So with the first test down, we follow Stark over to the home of Dr. Strange. And when we get there, Strange states that no matter how many charms and spells he cast, nothing seems to faze it. Even a spell meant to atomize anything it hits failed to do any damage. So with the second test a success, Tony thanks Strange for keeping Emma's book for safekeeping and moves on to the third and final challenge. And the third test brings us to Peter Parker, Spider-Man. Now the reason why he needs Peter is because he has some form of extrasensory perception, aka spider sense, that Tony could never quite explain. And the way he was able to test if the cane could bypass any sensory abilities was by hitting him in the shin with the Mysterium cane. And much like the two heroes before him, Peter was shocked about its capabilities because his spidey sense didn't go off. So with curiosity peaking in Spider-Man, he asks what was that thing Tony hit him with. In which Tony looks up towards the Sentinels flying by and says it's a weapon. So with that out there, Peter asks if he is going to use his new weapon to take down the Sentinels, in which Tony replies with, yes he will, at a time and place of his choosing. And everyone will know the signal when they see it. So everyone who was harmed by Phylong and Orchis will be avenged. So with that said, issue number 11 of Invincible Ironman comes to an end. So following issue number 11, we transition over to issue number 12. And when we get there, this issue opens with She-Hulk pleading a case on behalf of Rhodey. Because in case you forgot, Rhodey was falsely accused and imprisoned for killing a factory worker. But in She-Hulk's argument, this couldn't be possible because the man who died was killed with his phone on his person, which means he went home after Rhodey was arrested and killed the following morning. So with She-Hulk proving Rhodey's innocence, the opposition moves for Rhodey to remain in jail until a jury decides what is true and what is not. So with the verdict delivered, and Rhodey still imprisoned, She-Hulk in a fit of rage destroyed her rental car and tossed it into the distance. Because despite the overwhelming proof in Rhodey's favor, the courts is firmly within Orchis's grip. So following that, we quickly skip over to Tony Stark flying over the city gathering data on his enemy. And the way he does it is by flying up to a sentinel and placing a stealth tracker on them to analyze their flight patterns. So following that, we transition to the Hellfire Club with Tony Stark returning to his lab. And when he gets there, he is met by Wilson Fisk checking in on his investment. Because Wilson is only really helping mutant kind in hopes of getting his wife back safely, but unfortunately, his patience is wearing thin. Now this led to Wilson telling Tony that time is the only thing that they couldn't afford because it can't be purchased. So with that warning out there, Tony holds his tongue because he doesn't want to worry about a fight with Wilson Fisk, especially before his appointment arrives. So speaking of his appointment, Riri Williams aka Ironheart arrived at the front door and is met by Emma Frost. But see, at this point in the story, Ironheart has no idea that Hazel is Emma, so after a small verbal dispute, Ironheart tries to use her 10 rings to erase Emma's mind, but out of a reflex Emma jumps into the red triangle protocol and resists. So with a fight set before Emma, she immediately knocked off her inhibitor ring, and just like that, school was in session. Now, once in the dreamscape, Emma tells Ironheart that she wants to apologize for the unpleasant start. So with Emma's identity revealed, Riri asks if Tony is aware of Emma's identity, in which Emma makes it clear that he does, and after further inspection of Ironheart, Emma also notices Ironheart isn't a natural telepath, but instead an enhanced one. So with the two women at a stalemate, a battle within the mind kicks off, and before anything could be done, both women were fighting. And during this battle, Emma questions how the rings grant Ironheart telepathic abilities. Now this was something Ironheart had no problem showing Emma. So as the two fight it out, we skip over to Wilson Fisk and Tony having a conversation as a mutant detection alarm goes off. Now the reason why this is happening is because Orchis offered to install the detection system, and Wilson Fisk accepted it to keep up appearances to avoid suspicion. But with Emma using her abilities, it would be a matter of time until Orchis arrived. And when it comes to Wilson Fisk, lying was as natural as breathing to him, and considering they have a real situation on their hands, they will need it. So with a sentinel before them, Tony rushes the two women inside as Wilson claims that Mystique broke into his home and tried to assassinate him. Now the reason Wilson did this was to throw Orchis off Emma's tracks. So as the fight continued between Emma and Ironheart, Emma tells Ironheart that they don't have time for this because the Sentinels will arrive soon. And if she insists on continuing the fight, they could do it inside of one of Orchis's labor camps. So with the two women returning to reality, a giant sentinel ripped the roof right off the building. So with Emma's identity blown, Tony jumps straight into damage control mode and starts jamming the Sentinel's communication equipment to prevent it from relaying its findings to an Orchis satellite. So with the clock ticking, Emma tells Riri to throw her into the Sentinel while in her diamond form, which was perfectly fine by her. So with Emma being used as a bullet, all three of our heroes attack the Sentinel. So with seconds left on the clock, Riri took this opportunity to use a special weapon that Tony ordered, and that was Ant-Man's PIM particles. So with the Sentinel shrunken down, our heroes wasted no time in sealing the deal. So following this episode, Tony states that this had been their closest call with the Sentinels to date and almost blew their cover. But lucky for them, Fisk turned it all into an opportunity to deepen their cover. But unfortunately, by doing so, Fisk cast more bad publicity on mutant kind. But all that didn't matter, for over the next couple of hours Riri and Tony caught up on their work. And during that work session, Tony asks Riri if she could build the ships he designed. Now, normally Riri wouldn't have a single problem doing this, but she had to ask an important question. And that was, where on Earth would they find enough mysterium, secrecy, and safety to build it? And that is when Tony reveals to her that they're not planning on building the ships on Earth, but instead in space. But before she goes, she must be sure that she can get it done, because the lives of everyone on this planet depend on the success of the fabricating of these designs. Now always willing to accept a challenge, Riri agrees to do it. So with everything a go, Tony tells Ironheart to ask for Eitri as soon as she arrives at her destination. For Tony is sending her to the home of the dwarves. And as for how she was to transport the Mysterium, Tony had it all shrunken down using the PIM particles brought by Ironheart. So with this issue coming to an end, Riri sets off immediately as Tony and Emma go to the Morlock's tunnels to have a Thanksgiving meal with the X-Men and Unity Squad. So as the team spends this holiday together, everyone casts aside their worries just for a single night, for tomorrow they have work to do. And as for Rhodey, he too was able to join in on the celebration, as Tony sent him a necklace of the patron saint of prisoners made from Mysterium. So with that said, issue number 12 of Invincible Ironman comes to an end. So following issue number 12, we jump over to issue number 13. And when we get there, this issue starts off with Tony and Emma waiting on the hood of a car in the middle of an empty field preparing to go to space. And right on cue, the transport arrived, along with the Skrulls who would cover for their absences. So with the matter of appearances taken care of, there was still one more person who was tasked with helping them, and that was an Eternal and former Avenger, Star Fox. So with all the pieces in place and a promise of a big score, the team takes off into space. So just as Tony was sneaking off the planet in one direction, Ironheart was also making her way off-world. But she was tasked with transporting and building several ships based on Tony's designs in order to carry the mutants from Morocco to Earth for the invasion. So as Riri made her approach, her armor, strangely enough, wasn't cloaked when she boarded the Orchis orbital base. Because Riri had something better than a cloaking device, she was wielding the 10 rings of the Mandarin against Tony's advice. But Tony had to admit, the rings had some advantages, like being able to allow Riri the ability to cause a big enough distraction so she could commence her mission. And as for Riri, she wanted nothing more than to unleash the full power of the rings on Orchis, but thanks to Tony and a lot of convincing, that idea was completely shut down, because their forces weren't ready to retake Earth yet. Now on a side note, Tony wondered if he asked Ironheart to leave the planet because he was worried she would be corrupted by the rings. So as Riri managed to take the Orchis craft and escape, we transitioned over to Tony, Emma, and Star Fox arriving in Game World. And on a side note, at the bottom of the page is a quick cameo of Howard the Duck. But getting back to the story, when we get there, one of the first things we realize is Star Fox is trying his best to hit on Emma Frost, but unlucky for him, he is getting absolutely nowhere. So with all of Star Fox's attempts falling flat, they go their separate ways and prepare for the mission at hand. Because a little while ago the X-Men had delivered large amounts of Mysterium deposits to the casino so the casino could move it to where it needed to go. So as the elevator opened, our two heroes quickly realized that they just walked in the middle of someone else's heist, and by the looks of it, neither side was willing to back down. So with conversations collapsing between the two sides, Tony and Emma dived to safety as everyone started shooting. Now during the chaos, Emma points out how some other them were wearing side blockers, so to prevent catching a stray bullet, Emma phased into her diamond form. And in a stroke of brilliance, Emma leaped out onto the battlefield and allowed Tony to shoot his chest beam at her. Now, by doing this, the beam was reflected off of her in all directions, effectively putting an end to the conflict. So with everyone taken out, Star Fox, disguised as a woman about to give birth, enters the room. But to his dismay, his distraction was pointless as everything was already dealt with. So with nothing else left for the Eternal to do, Star Fox, Tony, and Emma made their way into the Mysterium Vault. Now, this Mysterium will turn out to be enough, and the secret of how to shape it would reside firmly in the hands of the angels. Now this means only Tony, Ironheart, and the X-Men Forge would walk away from this war with that knowledge. And once it all was collected, Tony sent most of the mutant metal with Star Fox for the construction of the ships, and kept just enough for himself to forge the Mark 72 armor out of it. So with everything accomplished, Star Fox promises that the metal would be delivered to the dwarves without a problem. But just to drive the point home, Tony once again reminded Star Fox that if the metal doesn't make it to the dwarves and Ironheart, then the Earth will fall. So as Emma and Tony make their way back to the Hellfire Club, the Skrulls who replaced them filled them in on their activities. The Skrulls tell them about how they made headlines going ice skating at Rockefeller Center and are looking forward to working with Tony again in the future. So with the married couple standing alone, they decided to throw caution to the wind and enjoy the night as well as each other. So as the two skate the night away, we transition to space, where we pick up with Ironheart making her way to her destination. Now Tony states that he still doesn't know what to call what happened next. Maybe it was Lady Luck, or maybe it was just mutant magic, or both. But while Ironheart was traveling in deep space on her way to rendezvous with the Mysterium, something unexpected happened that made her trip a little bit easier. Because Ironheart's system detected another ship in the area, and that ship was piloted by Forge. So as the two were saying their hellos to each other, Forge revealed how he was moments away from blasting her out of space when he saw the Orchis logo on the side of her ship. And as for how he made it all the way out in space and crossed her path, Forge tells Ironheart that he built a sextant that would take him wherever he needs to go. So when Riri asks how the ship works, Forge was unable to answer her because he actually had no idea. So with that less than satisfactory answer given, Forge proceeded to ask if Storm was doing okay. But before Ironheart could answer, a gigantic space dragon destroyed her ship. Now, the reason why the dragon did that was because it smelled the trapped souls of his brethren wrapped around Ironheart's fingers, in what she calls the Mandarin's 10 rings. So with that said, issue number 13 of Invincible Iron Man comes to an end. So with issue 13 coming to an end, we pick up in issue number 14. Now this issue opens with a dialogue from Tony Stark. And he is describing how he rarely dreams as Tony Stark, but instead as Iron Man. And in these dreams, more likely than not, he is usually getting his butt kicked all day long. And the sad part about this is that this is a recurring nightmare, and the orchestrator behind the entire thing is Magneto. Because no matter how smart and talented Tony is, all Magneto needs to do is crush him in his suit to win. So as the spear pierces Tony's heart, he jumps up in bed and wakes up from the nightmare. Now, due to this irrational fear, Tony spent months developing countermeasures to combat Magneto's powers. He managed to design technologies to protect himself, and now, said technology is being used against the innocent. So with that out there, this is when Emma Frost enters the room and tells him that she doesn't need her telepathic abilities to know he had a bad dream. So in a kind gesture, she offers Tony the option to forget. In which Tony responds by saying he used to make himself forget, but now he realizes that was bad for him. So with that said, Emma closes the window and makes her way to the nearby bed and undresses while saying, there is more than one way to make a man forget his troubles. So as the two get into bed, Tony tells Emma, after this is all over, he wants to have a conversation with her and figure their relationship out. But see, Emma isn't really concerned about the future because she saw his plans and she isn't sure Tony will make it out alive. So as their bodies join, we jump over to deep space. And when we get there, we see the massive dragon hovering over both Ironheart and Forge. And he is telling them how the 10 rings aren't weapons, but instead rings of tragedies, for he is aware how those rings exploit the spirit of his brethren. And if she doesn't heed his words, then she will suffer the consequences. Because he tells Ironheart that she has nothing to fear from himself, because the danger lies within her, because even the purest of hearts will compromise in the darkest of days. Because around her fingers, she has 10 curses that cannot be cleansed. And in due time, her soul will also be compromised unless she get rid of them. So with the message delivered, the dragon takes off, leaving Forge and Ironheart to have a conversation. And during their exchange, Ironheart reveals that she knew that these rings were alien artifacts, but what she did not know was that these rings were actually ghosts. So following that revealing encounter, we fast forward to the home of the dwarves, and when we get there, the dwarves tell them that the forge is down at the moment. And if by some miracle, they are able to relight the forge, then they can build their ships. So with the green light given, our two heroes dive headfirst into their work. And several days later, the forge was up and running with the fleet nearing completion, and as a thank you, Forge offered some of the remaining Mysterium as payment for allowing them to use their workstations. But unfortunately, the dwarves had something else in mind, aside from friendship. Because without warning, the dwarves drew a blade and dived toward Ironheart, saying they don't need both of them alive for them to spill their secrets on how to work Mysterium. But his attack was short-lived, as Ironheart blasted him away with the 10 rings. So with the battle on, Ironheart manifested the power of the rings again and grabbed hold of each dwarf and threatened to feed them to the void. And she was moments away from doing it until Forge stepped in and spoke some sense into her, by telling her that she doesn't want to live with their deaths on her consciousness. So with the help of Forge's wisdom, Ironheart began to realize what the consequences are for carrying those rings. And what scares her the most about everything is how comfortable she is getting with them on her hands. So with Ironheart coming to terms with the importance of getting rid of the rings, both her and Forge make their way to his sextant and place them on it. And just like that, the sextant activated and sent each ring scattered to the far corners of space where they are most needed. So with the rings spread across the entire universe, Ironheart questions the likelihood of them being used for evil in the future. In which Forge reassures her that even if it is used for evil in the future, it wouldn't be her fault. So with Ironheart free from the influence of the rings, we fast forward a little to the Stark fleet landing on Araco in full view of Orchis satellites before making their way to Earth. Now the reason why they did this was because they wanted Orchis to know they were coming. And thanks to the help of Firestar, the X-Men managed to trick Orchis into accepting the lie. Firestar tells them that she has a secret line of dialogue with the mutant resistance on Earth. And she pulled this off by taking credit for something Mystique did, which was freeing the Juggernaut. Now by doing this, she quote-unquote gained their trust. And as for Tony Stark, she tells them that he had been playing possum and has designed ships capable of withstanding their capital guns on Venus, Earth, and the Moon. So once he was through their defenses, he was planning on making landfall in the Australian outback. And the reason why they chose this location was because it would cause minimal collateral damage. So with all the information given, Moira states, the X-Men and the Avengers are so much alike. And which Phylon replies by saying, when Stark's ships arrive in the outback, every single Sentinel on Earth will be waiting for them there. And once the battle is over, and if Tony Stark still chooses not to join them as an official mascot, then he'll make Tony watch as Rhodey is killed. And then he will trap him inside an armor that he cannot command. And just to add insult to injury, Phylon will make sure the armor full life support system is working so he can see how long Tony lasts. So as all the humans and Orchis higher-ups exited the room, the androids and AIs remained. Now Phylon was so motivated by his hatred towards mutants and Tony that he was blinded by the danger under his own nose. Because within Orchis was artificial intelligence with their own designs. And they were not about to risk Tony surviving this battle for Phylon to have his fun. And considering the Mark 72 was almost done, it would have met its first test subject in the field. So with that said, issue number 14 of Invincible Iron Man comes to an end. But anyway, down in the comment section below, let me know your thoughts about this issue and what predictions you could have moving forward. So with that established, I hope you enjoyed this video, and please don't forget